Why is it that just when the noise of life begins to quiet down, the silence starts to hurt? You spent years being everything for everyone. The mother who stayed strong when no one asked how she was doing. The husband who worked late so his family didn't have to worry. The daughter who showed up again and again, even when her own heart was tired. Now the house is quieter. The kids are grown. Your calendar is no longer bursting with appointments. You finally have time to sit, to rest, to breathe, and yet something in you feels more lost than ever. Maybe you've asked yourself quietly, late at night, why do I feel more empty now, when life was supposed to feel lighter? Maybe it wasn't just one big thing. Maybe it was a slow unraveling. A friend who stopped calling. A body that doesn't move the way it used to. A birthday no one remembered. Or just that invisible shift inside, the kind that no one notices. Except you. There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from the sudden absence of noise, the roles you used to play, the chaos that once distracted you. And now, when all of that is gone, you're left face to face with something deeper, something raw, something wordless. But what if silence isn't the problem? What if silence is not an emptiness to fear, but a doorway to walk through? In Buddhist teachings, silence is not a void. It is where everything begins. It's not the absence of life. It's where life can be felt most honestly. And maybe, just maybe, the aching you feel in the quiet is not your undoing. Maybe it's your becoming. This video is not about escaping loneliness. It's not about fixing silence. It's about learning how to rest inside it, like a monk sitting beneath a Bodhi tree, not to run from the world, but to meet it fully, from within. So if you've been carrying a quiet sadness, if your heart feels heavy in the still moments, if you've wondered whether peace is still possible after 40, you're in the right place. No mantras to memorize. No pressure to change overnight. Just a gentle conversation, like a warm cup of tea on a rainy afternoon. If something in this already speaks to the part of you no one sees, hit subscribe. Not for us, but for that part of you that's still seeking something true. Part 1: The sound beneath the silence. There was a time in her life when quiet was a luxury. Elaine was 42 when she finally moved into a space of her own. No roommates, no teenage yelling through closed doors, no TV humming in the background just to drown out the ticking clock. For the first time in 2 decades, she woke up to birdsong and the slow rustle of trees brushing against the bedroom window. She thought she'd love it, and for a while she did. She sipped her tea slower, took longer walks, let herself linger in the grocery store, choosing tomatoes like she had all the time in the world. But after the 3rd week, something changed. It wasn't the silence itself that startled her. It was what started echoing inside it. At night, when the phone didn't ring, when no one needed her, when she wasn't planning dinner or listening to someone else's day, the stillness began to press in. Not loud, but heavy. She said it to herself once, out loud, just to hear how it sounded. I don't know who I am in this quiet. This is what many people don't talk about after 40. The way noise used to fill a space inside us. Not just the sound of other people, but the noise of responsibility, the swirl of busyness, the never-ending list of things to do that made us feel at least useful, needed, real. When all that starts to slow, when life gives us what we once said we longed for, time, peace, space, it can feel like we've lost the background music that told us who we were. Buddhist teachings say that silence is not empty. It's full of answers. But most of us were never taught to listen. We were taught to fill, to fix, to move forward, to turn on the TV, call someone, distract ourselves, or at the very least, scroll through something that doesn't ask us to feel too much. But the Dharma invites something else. It invites us to pause, not because silence is soft and sweet, but because silence is honest. There's a Zen saying, when the mind is still, the truth has a chance to speak. And when that stillness came for Elaine, the truth it spoke was this. She had wrapped her whole identity around being someone for others. A mother, a friend, partner, problem solver. Now, in the quiet, she was being asked, gently but firmly, to meet someone she hadn't spent much time with, herself. And at first, that self didn't feel like enough. But something happened one night, weeks into this new life. She couldn't sleep. Again. The ceiling felt like it was leaning closer. The silence was humming so loudly it buzzed in her ears. So she got up, sat in the old chair near the window, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and did something different. She listened, not to a podcast, not to music, not even to her thoughts. She just let herself be there. And in that space, she began to notice what had always been present but drowned out. The distant sound of the train a few streets away, the creak of the wooden floor adjusting to the night air, the subtle breath moving in and out of her nose, and something softened. The silence hadn't changed. She had. The very space that once felt like loneliness began to feel like presence. This is what Buddhist practice calls the first step in transformation. Not changing your life, not achieving some spiritual milestone, but simply turning toward the thing you've been avoiding and staying. It's not glamorous, it's not dramatic, but it's the moment your life starts to become yours again. Like the first time you sit on the bank of a quiet river, not to take a picture, not to record a meditation video, but to just sit. You might not hear any wisdom right away. That's okay. The sound beneath silence takes time to rise. It's like a shy animal in the forest. It only appears when you stop chasing it. Elaine didn't become a monk. She didn't start a YouTube channel about mindful living. She still had hard nights and mornings when the emptiness returned. But something had shifted. She no longer ran from the silence. She walked into it, and that made all the difference. Like standing beneath a winter tree, bare and quiet, and realizing it's not dead, it's just resting. So maybe that's what you're being invited to do too. Not fix, not fill, just rest. And let silence be the beginning, not the end. Part 2. The gentle pain of holding on too long. She never deleted his voicemails. 3 years after Daniel passed, his voice still lived inside her phone, tucked between old photos, weather apps, and unused coupons. There were 7 of them in total. Some were just reminders. Hey Han, don't forget the almond milk. Others were sweet nothings left on rushed lunch breaks. The last one, was from the hospital. Raspy, barely a whisper, still ending with, "Love you." Her name is Marissa, and for a long time she told no one about those messages. Every few weeks, especially on cold nights when the apartment felt too big for one person, she'd play one. Not the last one, never the last one. That one was sacred, but the everyday ones, the normal ones, the ones that made him feel alive again. She didn't think of it as clinging, just remembering. But every time the sound faded, she was dropped into a silence that felt sharper than before, lonelier, heavier. What Buddhist teachings remind us, gently, never with force, is this: attachment isn't about loving too much. It's about loving without breath. It's when we grasp, not out of celebration, but fear. Fear that letting go means losing everything. Fear that if we stop holding on, we'll fall apart. But the truth is, we already are. Just silently, slowly, without knowing it. Marissa was holding her grief like someone cradling broken glass. Too tightly, too carefully, and it was cutting her even as she tried to protect it. One night, after a particularly hard day, the anniversary of his passing, she sat in the living room and held her phone like it was a lifeline. Her thumb hovered over the message, her breath shallow. Then something strange happened. The phone slipped, just a little, enough to send the message playing before she was ready. It was the last one. She froze. She hadn't planned to hear it. But there it was. His voice, fragile but still familiar. He said her name, told her she'd be okay, asked her to smile again. Then silence, and something in her broke. Not the kind of breaking that destroys, the kind that opens. She wept, not like before. Not the quiet, careful tears of someone managing grief politely. No, these were full, body-shaking sobs. The kind that soundless silence makes space for. The kind that feel like 1,000 goodbyes wrapped into one. And when the crying finally softened, she sat still for a long time. Then, for the first time, she whispered back, "I love you, and I'll keep loving you." But I have to keep living too. She didn't delete the message. She didn't need to. Something had shifted inside her. The attachment wasn't gone, but it was no longer choking her. Buddhist teachings often talk about the lotus flower, how it rises from muddy water. But what's rarely said is how long it takes, and how hard it is to let the mud be mud without rushing the bloom. Attachment is natural. It's human. We love. We lose. We ache. We reach for pieces of the past as if they can build us a future. But peace doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from remembering without clinging. Marissa still has the messages, but she no longer plays them to fill silence. Now she lights a candle, sits with a photo, and listens not for his voice, but for her own. The voice that says, I am still here, and that is sacred. It's like standing on the shoreline, watching the tide carry something precious away, and whispering, thank you for staying as long as you did. Now I'll walk on. Letting go isn't the end of love. Sometimes it's how love matures, like autumn leaves. They don't fall because they're unloved. They fall because the tree knows it's time. So if you're still holding on to an old voicemail, an unopened box, a what if that lives in your chest, know this, you don't have to let go all at once. But maybe today you can breathe a little softer, hold a little looser, and trust that the part of them you truly loved never leaves. It just lives in a quieter place now. Right here. Part 3. Learning to trust what changes. He hadn't been back in over 30 years. The house looked smaller than he remembered. The driveway where he once skinned his knees was cracked now, overgrown with weeds. The front door had been painted a new color. There were toys scattered across the lawn, but not the kind he used to play with, new shapes, new sounds. A new family had moved in. David stood across the street, hands in his coat pockets, unsure why he even came. His parents were gone. The house had been sold the year before, but something in him needed to see it. Maybe to say goodbye. Maybe to understand why the ache of change was still living somewhere in his chest. He didn't walk up to the door. He didn't knock. He just stood, quietly, watching a place that no longer belonged to him, but would always live in him. That's the thing no one teaches us. Not in school, not even in grief. That places, people, even identities we once held tight, don't ask permission before they change. And most of us, after 40, carry more change than we know what to do with. Jobs disappear. Marriages shift. Bodies soften, slow down. We lose people, sometimes suddenly, sometimes by slow erosion. And we keep trying to anchor ourselves to something solid, only to realize the shoreline keeps moving. David told himself for years that he was fine with change. But standing there, looking at that house, he realized he had been carrying a version of his past in his mind like a photograph. Untouched, unchanged. But life isn't a photograph. It's a river. And rivers don't ask to be held. They ask to be followed. Buddhism teaches anicca, impermanence. It's one of the most foundational truths in the Dharma. Everything changes. Everything. And while that might sound harsh or even hopeless at first, it's actually what makes life beautiful. Because if pain is impermanent, so is sadness. If joy is impermanent, so is grief. If today is hard, tomorrow will not be the same. David stood there longer than he expected. At one point, a little girl peeked through the window, not out of fear, just curiosity. She waved. He waved back. And for a moment he saw it clearly. The house had not died. It had continued. New laughter, new memories, new life. He turned to leave, and with each step back to his car, he felt lighter. Not because the past had vanished, but because he no longer needed it to stay frozen. That night, he lit a candle beside an old photo of his parents. And for the first time, he didn't feel like he was mourning. He felt like he was honoring. The past isn't meant to be a prison. It's a garden. And even the most beautiful flowers don't last forever. But they bloom again, somewhere else, in someone else. Just like the Dharma says, everything changes, and everything continues. Impermanence doesn't mean that love fades. It means that love evolves, like watching the moon rise, knowing it will wane, and still standing in awe of its light. So if you're holding tightly to something, a version of who you were, a place you thought would never change, a rhythm that no longer fits your life, maybe today is the day you let it move. Not because you're giving up, but because you're growing. And what's meant to stay always finds a new way to return. Even if it's just in the way a breeze touches your cheek, the smell of cinnamon that reminds you of home, or the warmth of a stranger's smile on a quiet street. Change is not a thief. Sometimes it's a messenger. Part 4. Peace begins where resistance ends. She used to fight her reflection. Every morning, like clockwork, Maya would stand in front of the mirror and scan for change. The grays she plucked yesterday were back. The lines under her eyes seemed deeper. Her body, once firm, predictable, easy to manage, now felt like a stranger's. There were days she barely recognized the woman looking back at her. And truthfully, there were days she didn't want to. Menopause hit like a silent wave. Not sudden, not loud, but unrelenting. Sleep vanished. Mood swings arrived like uninvited guests. Her body ached. Her skin changed. But more than all of that, she felt invisible. Not to others, to herself. She would smile at coworkers, cook dinner for her family, even post cheerful updates on social media. But inside, she was quietly grieving. Not for a lost youth, that was never what she missed. It was the loss of knowing herself that rattled her most. The woman she had known for 40 years, capable, sharp, energetic, seemed to have slipped away without leaving a note. One evening, after a long day of pretending she was fine, Maya sat alone in her kitchen. The hum of the fridge, the soft ticking of a nearby clock. Silence again, and instead of filling it with distraction, she did something different. She picked up a book on Buddhist teachings that a friend had given her. One she had ignored for months. She flipped it open at random. The page read, "Suffering is not in the thing itself. Suffering is in our resistance to what is." She read it again and again. It landed like a truth she already knew but had never spoken aloud. The suffering she felt wasn't just from her body changing. It was from the fight, the constant pushing back, the silent war between who she was and who she thought she was supposed to be. The next morning, she didn't avoid the mirror. She sat down in front of it. No creams, no plucking, no adjustments, just looked and whispered quietly, "I see you." There was no magical transformation. The aches didn't disappear. The foggy mornings still came, but the war began to end. Slowly, gently. Buddhism teaches us that peace doesn't arrive when life gets easier. It arrives when we stop insisting that life should be something else. Acceptance isn't passive. It's not giving up. It's choosing to be present with what is, without needing it to be different. And for Maya, that presence became her doorway back to herself. She started lighting incense in the mornings, not for ritual, just for stillness. She replaced her morning self-critique with a silent bow. Not to worship, but to honor the woman who had walked through fire and still rose each day. And slowly, her sense of self returned. Not the old self, a deeper one. One that didn't need to be flawless to be worthy. One that didn't need to hustle for belonging. One that knew, I am not broken. I am becoming, like the forest after the rain, messy, fragrant, real. Acceptance didn't erase her pain, but it gave her peace inside the pain. And that, she realized, was the deeper miracle. So if you're waking up tired, if your reflection feels like a stranger, if life feels like it's shifting faster than you can hold on to, maybe the most radical thing you can do is stop resisting. Let your life be what it is today. Let your breath be uneven. Let your heart be tender. And in that soft, surrendered space, you might hear something true again. Not from the world, from within. Like the quiet bloom of a wildflower. Unplanned, unnoticed by most, and yet fully itself. Always enough. Part 5. When life breaks you open. For 30 years, Mr. Keller was the man everyone relied on. He was the first to arrive at school, the last to leave. The kind of teacher who remembered every student's name, even decades later. Birthdays, favorite colors, which child needed an extra sandwich packed discreetly in their bag. Then, one June morning, he retired. No send-off could have prepared him for the silence that followed. At first, it was novel, waking up without an alarm, reading the newspaper in full, walking to the grocery store mid-morning just because he could. But by autumn, the days started to stretch too long. And by winter, they began to feel empty. He found himself wandering through old lesson plans, straightening shelves that didn't need straightening, making coffee just to feel the warmth of something in his hands. And though no one said it, he felt it in every unanswered phone call, every well-meaning, "enjoy your retirement," a quiet truth humming underneath. He was no longer needed. What Buddhist teachings remind us is this: sometimes adversity doesn't come as disaster, it comes as disappearance. The loss of a role, a rhythm, a place in the world. And when that happens, the silence can be deafening. One day, Keller sat in the park where he used to take his students for field trips. He watched a group of young kids chasing each other, their voices bright against the stillness. For the first time in months, he didn't feel bitter. He felt broken, not in a hopeless way, in a tender way, like a shell cracking open from the inside. That same week, he walked into the local library, asked if they needed volunteers. The librarian, a woman in her 30s with tired eyes and 2 toddlers at her feet, lit up. "We've been praying someone like you would walk in." He started reading to children every Tuesday, just 1 hour, one small room, 10 kids and a circle of beanbags. But something strange began to happen. As he read, his voice, once unused, quiet, came alive again, not because of the words, but because someone was listening. And when the stories ended, the children would stay, ask questions, tell him about their day. One little boy, Noah, started calling him Mr. K, and just like that, he was someone again. Not a title, not a role, just someone. And here's the thing, Keller hadn't been broken by retirement. He'd been broken open. The identity that once defined him had fallen away. But what remained was the deeper self. The one that could love without being called teacher. The one that could serve without applause. Buddhism speaks of dukkha, the suffering that comes from clinging to what's already past. But it also teaches that suffering is not the end. It's the soil. And in that soil, if we're willing to stay, something new can bloom. Keller still has lonely days. But now he walks through them differently. He no longer sees silence as punishment. He sees it as preparation for the next connection, the next soft moment, the next chance to show up. He says the hardest part wasn't the loss. It was the belief that nothing meaningful could come after it. Now he knows better. When life breaks you open, don't rush to patch yourself up. Let the light come in. Let others see you in your not knowing. And in time, you'll find that the version of you who rises after the storm, quieter, more spacious, more present, is the one you were always meant to meet. Like a mountain flower blooming after snow, you just needed to be still long enough for spring to find you. Part 6, returning home to the present. Her hands moved slowly through the soapy water. It was just a bowl and a spoon. Nothing special, just leftovers from a quiet lunch. But as Judith moved the sponge in slow, circular patterns, something about the moment felt fuller than it should have. Like time had stopped stretching ahead and behind her and just settled here. In the warmth of the water, in the shimmer of light through the window, in the steady, unremarkable now. It hadn't always been like this. For most of her life, Judith lived 2 steps ahead, always thinking, planning, preparing. She was the one who packed the bags before anyone remembered the trip, who knew where the flashlight was before the storm came, who could tell you the birthdays, allergies, and favorite meals of 3 generations without needing to look. But after her husband passed, all of that anticipation turned into a haunting. She couldn't plan anymore, didn't know what she was preparing for. The kids were grown. The house was too big. The calendar didn't fill up like it used to. So her mind, once a brilliant mapmaker, began drifting, wandering through old memories like a ghost walking hallways no one else saw. And the hardest part? She was never here, even when she was. Judith would sit in the garden but think about the doctor's appointment 2 months ago. She'd fold laundry while replaying a conversation from last year. She couldn't sleep, Not because she wasn't tired, but because her mind refused to stop rehearsing regrets or imagining endings that hadn't even come. Then, one morning, a neighbor, a soft-spoken Buddhist nun who tended her rose bushes like prayer beads, brought over soup. And before she left, she said just one sentence: "Sometimes, the best place to return is the breath." Judith nodded politely, unsure what to make of it. But that night, as she stood at the sink, sponge in hand, she remembered. Return to the breath. So she did. One breath, then another, and with each inhale, she felt her chest expand. With each exhale, a small space opened inside, quiet, unhurried. She noticed the softness of the bubbles, the way the spoon glinted in the light, the sound of water dripping into the porcelain sink. For the first time in weeks, she felt alive. Not because anything spectacular had happened, but because she had finally returned to where life always lives. Here, Buddhist practice doesn't begin on a mountaintop. It begins in a breath, in the sound of your feet on the floor, in the weight of your body in a chair, in the simple, sacred act of noticing the world, not as you wish it were, but as it is. Mindfulness is not about fixing the mind. It's about coming home. And for Judith, home wasn't the house she lived in. It was the moment she stopped fighting the now. She started folding her clothes slowly, eating without distraction, talking to the plants on her windowsill, laughing when a spoon slipped into the sink too fast. Not as a performance of mindfulness, but as a rediscovery. She didn't need a new life. She needed to arrive in the one she already had. Now, when her thoughts drift to the past, as they still sometimes do, she doesn't scold herself. She just smiles, places one hand gently on her chest, and breathes, because this moment is enough. It always was. We just forget. Like returning home after a long journey, fumbling for the light switch and realizing the light was never off. We had just been looking in the wrong room. So if you're drifting through memory, through longing, through the ache of what once was, try this. Don't chase peace. Just wash the dish. Just feel your feet. Just notice this breath. And suddenly you're home again. Part 7: Inner stillness is not emptiness. There's an old bronze bell that sits in the center of a quiet temple in the mountains of Japan. It doesn't ring often. Not because it's broken, but because it was never meant to be struck in chaos. The monks who care for it say this: the bell only sings when the world is silent enough to hear it. And maybe so do we. After 40, after the careers and the children and the rushing that once felt like purpose, there comes a pause. Not always planned, sometimes gentle, sometimes jarring, but always still. For many, that pause feels like emptiness. No more packed calendars, fewer phone calls. The quiet evenings stretch long and wide like an ocean you never learned how to swim in. And inside that stillness, there's a fear that maybe something is missing, that maybe you are. But Buddhist wisdom tells a different story. Stillness is not emptiness. It's clarity. It's not what's left when life slows down. It's what's revealed. There was a man named Robert who spent most of his life running. Not literally, but emotionally. Every new project, every invitation, every distraction was a way to keep from feeling the dull ache of unspoken grief. He had lost his brother when he was 21, and rather than sit with the pain, he sprinted through life, hoping momentum could muffle memory. Then one day, the world slowed him down, not with a tragedy, but with early retirement. He laughed about it to his friends, joked that he'd take up golf. But when the days came, slow, long, hollow, he found himself staring out the window at the same tree every morning, wondering who he was now that he wasn't productive. At first, he tried to fill the time. Books, podcasts, volunteer work, but none of it touched the ache. Until one morning, he did something strange. He did nothing. He sat, not to meditate, not to think, just to sit. And for a while, it felt unbearable, as if the silence itself was peeling something open inside him. But he stayed, and then, without planning, without effort, the tears came. Not the kind that demand drama, the kind that simply arrive when the soul finally has space to speak. He thought he was mourning his brother, but really, he was mourning all the versions of himself he had abandoned trying to be okay. And in that stillness, something opened. A kind of peace he had never found in motion. Not because life got easier, but because he finally let himself hear the bell that had always been there, the one that only rings when we stop running. This is what Buddhism means when it speaks of sunyata. Not a void, but a fullness that exists when ego, noise, and grasping fall away. In stillness, we don't become less. We return to what's real. Your stillness is not a sign of irrelevance. It's an invitation to notice the breath, to feel the softness of your own presence, to remember that the part of you that is most awake, most whole, most loving, has always lived in silence. It's like a pond that only reflects clearly when the wind stops stirring its surface. When we are young, we chase sound, chase identity, chase meaning in motion. But in the second half of life, the Dharma invites us into the deeper work, listening, not to the world's demands, but to the subtle, sacred rhythm of your own being. So if you are in a season of quiet, if the phone doesn't ring, if the door doesn't knock, if the world feels far away, don't assume something is wrong. Maybe something is finally right. Maybe life has grown quiet not to abandon you, but to introduce you to yourself. Like an old bell waiting to be heard. Not because it's loud, but because now you are finally ready to listen. So maybe stillness was never about silence after all. Maybe it was about returning to the self we've been too busy to know. Returning to the breath we forgot we had. Returning to the truth that never left us. If this touched something in you, a memory, a moment, a breath you didn't know you needed, let it sit with you tonight. And maybe ask yourself this: what if the life you're meant to live now can only begin in stillness? Thank you for being here. If this brought you a little peace, you're always welcome to sit with us again. Subscribe if it feels right. No rush, no pressure. Just a seat by the window and the quiet ringing of a truth that was never far away.